So we are live. So, first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Friston. He is a British neuroscientist. He is well known for developing statistical parametric mapping and the free energy principle, which we all know is groundbreaking. It explains the brain how the brain minimizes uncertainty to maintain internal order. He is a leading figure in computational neuroscience and is based at University College of London. Um, Dr. Friston, if there's anything you would like to add.
No, that was a very concise summary of my achievements and commitments. It's very nice of you to invite me to speak to you.
All right. So my first question to you would be, how would you say that what are your opinions on AI in general? Do you think it is just a fad? Like some people think that it will change the entire world completely, but some people believe it will have an almost as equal impact as, let's say, smartphones or radio had on our world. What what are your opinions on how much impact it might create?
Well, that's a challenging question. I think much depends upon how broad your definition of artificial intelligence is. If one takes a very broad definition, I think we've had various forms of artificial intelligence for many, many decades. Certainly with the advent of computers and email through to spell checkers, and obviously all the functionality that it comes along with mobile phones. I think this has, certainly impacted and will continue to impact the way that we live and the way that we interact and behave at quite a fundamental level. And I have in mind here the notions that people like Andy Clark, a philosopher who introduced the notion of extended cognition and the designer environment, I think neatly summarized by the notion that the very fact you can record all your friends and family's phone numbers in your iPhone means that you're downloading a lot of your cognitive ability into an artifact, into the environment. So in the most general sense of artificial intelligence, having the ability to extend the cognitive processes, mnemonic processes, computing processes, inferential processes beyond our own brain by the use of tools that become part of our lived world and our ecosystem. I think AI has already had a tremendous impact upon society and will continue to do so, and it will be a definitive aspect of our evolution. The other answer, I think, would take a rather narrow view of artificial intelligence as it has been popularized in the past year or so since the advent of generative AI. So if you mean by AI the kind of artificial intelligence that you will see on the media and you'll see on blog posts, that is certainly more, I think, subject to arguments about a hype cycle and arguments about, is this going to have an enduring impact? Will there be a rebound? At what level will things stabilize? Is it incremental? Has it already reached a ceiling? So I think the answer there is slightly different. So if we're talking about generative AI in the sense of large language models, for example, or a move from say deep RL to transformer architectures that generate content from content, specifically language, such as ChatGPT. I think the answer is different there on two grounds. First of all, a lot of this change has not been a change in the technology or the competence or the functionality of artificial intelligence. It's been a reflection of the fact that it is accessible to everybody. And the second point that comes to mind, because of that, there has been a very quick increase in the awareness of the potential of artificial intelligence or generative AI, simply because people can use it. They can use it in their own homes. Usually, a quick acceleration of awareness of a particular technology does conform to a hype cycle. So it goes up from your point of view, it goes up and then down again and then levels out. I think a number of people at the moment think that we're probably at the peak and there's going to be a rebound, that it's not going to make a difference and people are going to be focusing on the dangers of generative AI. And then there will be a happy equilibrium when things have settled down. And there are a number of reasons for that. So generative AI, read as effectively the deployment of large language models, is not, many people think it's not sustainable, both in terms of the functionality, but also in terms of the amount of intellectual and thermodynamic resources required to power this kind of artificial intelligence. That interestingly also translates into an economic insustainability. So there are now big questions being asked about whether the people who are producing this kind of artificial intelligence actually have a workable economic model. Will they ever be able to make a profit? And you could even argue that argue transcends to deploying more generic artificial intelligence in autonomous vehicles. The other thing that I think attends the generative AI is that it is based on a very particular kind of technology, which is effectively backpropagation of errors and reward learning, that requires an enormous amount of data. And one could argue that the amount of data is limited, so that there will be a ceiling to the functionality of that kind of artificial intelligence that is based upon reinforcement learning or deep RL schemes as implemented in the context of backpropagation. So that, I think, is an observation which speaks to the trajectory of the impact. Yet one might argue that there can be no further substantive improvement in what current generative AI can do, because it's already used up most of the data. So there's a law of diminishing returns that will only get worse, as it were. So I'm ambivalent. I think AI is a wonderful thing to do, and it has had a profound effect on our lives and will continue to do so. But that is a definition of AI in a very generic or broad sense. Generative AI, I think, is a beautiful piece of engineering, but it has its limitations. And I think hard questions need to be asked about whether it will be a sustainable part of our electronic or informational ecosystem, or a part of the intelligence and computing abilities that we will be leveraging in the next decade or two.
Yes. You said that the technology existed, but the only thing that changed is that everyone now has access to it. My question to you would be, do you think that change has been good for the academia? Because you work primarily in academia, so like that is my question to you.
Again, that's a very interesting question. And again, I'm afraid my answer is going to be ambivalent, yes and no. So the good things about it are that it does represent easy access to human knowledge that is contained in textual material that has been archived over the decades and indeed centuries. And as such, it provides the kind of access that one, say, 5 years ago would use Wikipedia to access. But now you can just, with appropriate skills in terms of prompting large language models, pick out exactly what you want to know very, very quickly. So in terms of being able to retrieve information and thereby broaden information or the backdrop to your thinking or your decision making or your scientific exploration or indeed your clinical decisions, you have easy and immediate access to knowledge. That's, I think, a very, very good thing. The negative aspect is that in creating generative AI, you've now created an opportunity for people to generate material. And if they now direct that material to peer review, or they use that to write reviews of papers, or indeed write the paper itself, I think that's a dangerous thing, in the sense that the architecture of generative AI and large language models precludes a certain kind of explainability that reflects the fact that there is no formal reasoning that is grounded in the way that you and I reason and think about things. It has no foundational training in terms of the causal structure of the world in which we live. What it knows is how to describe it in words, and how we as humans have described it in words. As such, it can make lots of mistakes. This Gary Marcus told me he invented the word hallucination to describe the kind of mistakes it makes, which means it's very important now to be able to say, well, this information came from a trustworthy source that is veridical and has a degree of validity, and this kind of information was generated by a large language model, and therefore I should not trust it until it has been properly fact-checked or validated in some kind of way. That's not always easy to do, to the extent that there are certain institutions, academic institutions, and indeed journals that actually now preclude you using artificial intelligence in communicating science. And at that level, I personally don't. I've never used a large language model, so I'm not part of this game. But certainly at that level, I am very sympathetic to the arguments that it could be a dangerous thing, simply because it's generating so much content which has very low quality in terms of advancing our ideas. The other part of the other argument on the sort of negative response is that it cannot generate anything new, because it is just a beautiful summary of what is known, and more specifically, what is known that can be articulated in language. So it's not going to be useful in terms, strictly speaking, in terms of creating anything new. You could argue that it prompts you to think about new ideas, but then the question has to be asked: who's intelligent, the prompter or the large language model? So there is that perspective as well.
Okay, so I would like to ask you, do you think neuroscience research which you do can have any impact in AI itself? Like to for the betterment of AI, not the other way around.
Yes, I think so. And you can make the argument that neuroscience is actually fundamental in terms of underwriting the developments in AI research, but also currently specifying the right directions of travel. And you can make that argument from a number of different perspectives. You could make it from the point of view of sustainability. So, I mentioned before that the current direction of travel in artificial intelligence and machine learning is not sustainable. So, for example, I think I heard on the news that Microsoft are now starting again the nuclear power plant on Long Island, in order to power the data warehouses and the GPUs required to do the machine learning in order to support this technology. That's not sustainable. You're diverting a substantive percentage of our energy resources and carbon footprint to this kind of technology is not a sustainable way forward. So what is a sustainable way forward? Well, you have to look at natural intelligence. So this brings to the table the notion that the competence of artificial intelligence can be matched in many domains, and is matched and vastly superseded by natural intelligence, and remarkably by intelligent machines that just run on very small amounts of electricity of the kind that you would require to run a light bulb, say 20 watts. So your brain and my brain just consumes 20 joules per second. And this contrasts with the sort of megajoules required for data farms and say cloud computing and the like, or the training of these very large models. So one has to ask, what is so efficient about your brain and my brain, and can we now take the principles of efficient computation that is biomimetic and specifically neuromimetic, and now use them and instantiate them in artificial intelligence research. So that would be one quite fundamental example of how the life sciences, in particular neuroscience in this instance, can be used to redirect the development of artificial intelligence research that has not just commercial but global consequences. That efficiency I was focusing on there was efficiency in terms of thermodynamics and the work required or the heat generated to learn something or to infer something or to compute. But it also speaks to some fundamental principles about computing to exist, having sentient behavior that is consistent with the eco niche in which you find yourself. So this kind of efficiency is more akin to or related to the statistical efficiency and the optimization or the objective functions that underwrite the optimization of things that think or things that are intelligent or engage in sentient behavior. And at that level, I think people are now turning to the principles that you will find in neuroscience, first principle accounts of how the brain works. There is a third, if you like, perspective on this argument, which is the notion of mortal computation that comes along with a commitment to doing things in a more biologically plausible way, and that's the notion of mortal computation. So this is a notion from Geoffrey Hinton that makes a distinction between software that is immortal and software that runs on a substrate or a hardware, say wetware, for example, neural networks in your brain, where the actual hardware or the substrate of the computation matters. So that when the substrate dies, the software also dies, and that becomes now mortal. And that speaks to two important considerations. First of all, if you don't have mortal computation and you run immortal programs on a computer, you're almost invariably using a Turing, a von Neumann architecture. And that's important because the von Neumann architecture is such that you have to read and write from random access or working from memory. So all the operations you do in terms of learning something, let's say changing the values of some tensor in a tensor network, require you to take everything from memory into working memory, operate upon it, and then put it back again. And that's called the von Neumann bottleneck, or the memory wall. And it is that operation which uses the most energy and the most time. And therefore, one asks, is there any kind of artificial intelligence that eludes the von Neumann bottleneck? And of course, the answer is yes, it's mortal computation in the way that the brain does it. And this is sometimes known as in-memory processing or processing in memory or compute in memory, where you're actually doing it on the hardware. So your computations are actually in the memory, not in the working memory, so that you never have to pay the price of reading and writing from memory. So that would be one important motivation for a more biomimetic, neuroscience-inspired kind of compute, where, for example, the synaptic weights in your brain matter. And they're actually physically realized. And if I change those weights, I change the software that you run and the way that you think and perceive, act and decide. And furthermore, and this is an argument brought to the table by my colleague Alex Alexandra. Being mortal is important because it means all the imperatives that shape the way that you work are all in the game of extending your mortality. If you could never die, there would be no point in if you could never cease, there would be no imperative to survive. And that would remove any selective pressure, both at an evolutionary scale, but also selective pressure in the way that we actually devise algorithms and artifacts that have that kind of intelligence. So those are a few ways I could go on. There are certain principles that one finds in neuroscience that are only now emerging in artificial intelligence research. So one simple example of this would be the distinction between backpropagation of errors in, say, large language models or variation autoencoders, which is a non-local operation. So you're passing messages right up into a deep hierarchy and back again, which is completely different from the way that your brain and my brain works, where it's all local. So the notion of having a local energy function or objective function underwriting your computation and your functionality now becomes another central neuroscientific principle that could and should be instantiated in artificial intelligence research. And in so doing, you're also taking the pressure off that memory wall and the energy consumption, thereby making your artificial intelligence more robust, more sustainable, more efficient, both statistically and thermodynamically.
Okay. I think you explained all your arguments extremely passionately and extremely in an extremely detailed manner. Thank you very much for this. And one last question for you, just to have a little sense of humor. Do you think AI could become as it is in movies? Just to lighten the
Could
mood.
become what?
As it is shown in the movies.
Yes. I don't see why not. In principle, I don't see why they shouldn't. I mean, that's both a fun question, but it's also, I think, quite an insightful question, because we've just been talking about the importance of being like me and you, the importance of being biomimetic. We are existence proofs of the right way to instantiate intelligent artifacts. So the more like us any AI is, the more likely it is to be viable and to be sustainable. So I think specifically the kind of AI you see in the movies, like She or AI or and the like, or was it Her? Or, I can't remember now. But the more like us the artificial intelligence is, I think the better it will be, and the more sustainable it will be. And I suspect later on that we'll get into arguments about why it can't be any other way. So when you think about what it is to be a good computer or a good intelligence, then you actually started off the introduction by saying the whole point of free energy minimization is to resolve uncertainty. And of course, if I'm living in a world of people and artificial intelligences, the best way to reduce uncertainty is to make sure that everything in my world is predictable and like me. So you and I can try to speak the same language, that we have a common consensus, we're singing from the same song sheet, so that you can predict me and I can predict you, and we resolve the uncertainty. I think exactly the same arguments extend to an extended ecosystem that has you and me in it, and all of us, but also artificial artifacts that now become more and more like me. And you can see this in things like Siri and a lot of the things that people enjoy using. They enjoy using it simply because it's like me. And we come back to large language models. Why are people so excited about large language models? Because they can understand them. They can predict what they're going to say, and they can predict what you're going to say. And indeed, that's how they work, just predicting what you might say next, given a particular prompt.
I am supposed to move on and let you give your presentation and then move on to your research. But I have one more question. Do you think the difference between, like, do you think if we increase the computational power, we will reach that stage? Is it just the computational power, or is there something else as well to it?
I think it's more computational efficiency than power, to be quite honest. If you look at the mathematics of intelligence, and I always read intelligence as effectively inference and learning, or to be more complete, inference, learning, and selection, either selecting the right models or selecting the right data. If these processes are effectively processes of inference, that you can also think in terms of measurement or description, then they have to comply with certain fundamental principles that don't suggest big compute is optimal. They're always, in fact, the opposite. So I'll just give you a few examples. If we look at the roots, the fundaments that underlie universal computation, then what one discovers is they start with notions of algorithmic complexity. And the most likely and the best kinds of representational compute are those that provide minimal algorithmic complexity, sometimes articulated in terms of minimum description length or minimum message length. What this means is that your representation of the world and the way that you act in order to improve that representation of the world is aimed at maximally compressing, finding the simplest explanation for all the data that you have to sample or that you actively sample. So this notion of compression is very important, and I repeat, inherits from an algorithmic complexity perspective that can be developed through Sonomov induction through to universal computation. And it's something that complexity minimization is something that people like Jürgen Schmidhuber would really emphasize. So Jürgen Schmidhuber was the inventor of the long short-term memory, which is used a lot in, say, mobile phones. So he always says that, to have fun and to be intelligent is to compress. So that's in the opposite direction from big data and big models, completely opposite. So you're looking at much more efficiency. The other way of articulating that is in terms of the view of intelligence as inference under a true generative model of the world. And the objective here is to, if you're a statistician or a measurer, an observer, or in fact you and me, the objective here is to gather data that maximizes the evidence for my model of the sensed world. Now that evidence has two parts to it. It has an accuracy part and a complexity part. And the evidence of the log of the evidence is equal to accuracy minus complexity. So, and the complexity part is effectively scoring the degrees of freedom you're using up in your model to explain or provide an accurate explanation of the data. So again, if you're trying to maximize the evidence, and we'll probably hear later, equivalently minimize a bound on the evidence, a variational bound called free energy, then what you're trying to do is to find the smallest, simplest explanation for the data that remains sufficiently accurate. So again, I don't think that bigger computers are the answer. I think that smaller computers are the answer. And that, again, presents a view of artificial intelligence research, which is away from large language models and big data, and exactly the opposite direction to small, efficient models that are compliant with Occam's principle and James's principle of maximum entropy, which is another way of expressing this compression or this complexity minimization under constraints, which are accuracy constraints. So that would basically speak to not big data, but smart data, intelligently sampled small data. So I think that's a really excellent question. So I expect to see over the next few years people turning away from large models and big data and now looking at small, smart models, possibly deployed on the edge, having an ecosystem of small, smart artifacts that are all synchronized and talking to each other in the right kind of way, very much like you were talking about in terms of maintaining this degree of mutual predictability. They're all doing it as efficiently as possible using the minimum amount of data and the minimum complexity, namely degrees of freedom, or say parameters or connection weights implicit in their generative models.
One of our panelists actually have a question. Manya, can you speak? You raise your hand. Okay, I guess it was by mistake. Shreyansh, yeah, speak.
Uh, yeah, so actually, I had a question about the use of AI for generating novel ideas. So basically, the journal Nature. In it, there was an article that was generated from scratch with the help of ChatGPT within a day. So while you say that the AI cannot generate novel ideas, it can certainly exploit the current research gaps. So what do you have to say about its uses in that?
Could you give an example of exploiting current research gaps? Are we talking about protein folding or applications
So
for climate
actually, I
change?
meant like in the journal Nature, there was an article which was purely generated from ChatGPT from the scratch, everything within
Oh,
a
I
day.
see.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and it was not a novel idea, but it was exploiting a current research gap that was identified by ChatGPT.
Yes. So I think these examples are very entertaining, very engaging, and very compelling. Um, are they useful in terms of generating new hypotheses? I suppose that you could certainly your phrase, filling in the gaps, I found was interesting. Certainly, you could argue that interpolating between two models or hypotheses will create a hypothesis space that then one can explore. I think that that there certainly is an argument to that if the space of hypotheses or arguments or ideas are themselves sufficiently structured to allow that kind of metric interpolation of the kind that you would of the kind that is required for large language models to work in virtue of the fact that they have this kind of semantic embedding. They're sort of assuming that some metric space, some conceptual space that is underwritten by the semantics. So yes, that's a very interesting idea. My argument was more, though, that it depends upon you reading the output of the large language model to say, oh, that hasn't been done before, perhaps I should try it. So it still requires a human in the loop to recognize the potential importance of this new idea. The large language model cannot in itself act upon the world in order to actually perform an experiment to test its ideas. That competency lies within an agent. At the moment, large language models are not agents, but you are. So you can certainly use generative AI as a way of generating hypotheses that then you as an agent can design an experiment to test, and then improve your model of the world, and then you can tell the large language model about it. So that might be one example of this sort of extended cognition, where now not only are you putting your memory of phone numbers into a computer, you're now actually putting your cognitive reasoning and ideas in language, into the environment via reciprocal interaction or use of generative AI. Generative AI. Is that the kind of answer you had in mind?
Yeah, basically, so the research gap they are exploiting is basically because we are identifying that gap with the help of the AI, and then we are publishing the paper.
I would let you move on to the presentation now, and then my colleague Shreyansh would have questions for you. Is that all
Thank
right?
you.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes, we don't have to do the presentation. I just prepared just in case
No,
you
I
want.
would actually really like to see it.
Okay, then.
Yeah.
It's very short, and it's meant to be slightly funny, but it is simply a list of key bits of advice that people have given me, and I now give to young people of your age when considering a career in medicine, but where you also want to make a difference in terms of research and development, or becoming a clinical academic. And just to illustrate it with the things that I've done in my career. So I'll try and share my screen. Now, select a tab to share.
It's right to the smiley.
Yeah, I've got it. And I'll try this one, see if it works.
Yes.
Right. What can you see?
Your screen.
Can you see how to get ahead in neurobiology?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay. So, so how to get ahead in neurobiology. So the first funny story goes right back to when I was 15, and answers the question, how to get ahead. With the first answer is get good career advice. So this picture is me when I was about 15, and that's Graham Jackson, my woodwork teacher. And I'm answering questions on one of the very first computers in the United Kingdom in Liverpool. And this computer was programmed to take as input all your preferences and aspirations and competences, and then suggest the best career that you should pursue in later life. And it took this, at this point in the history of computer science, all computers worked with punch cards, so physically had little cards with holes in. You had to feed into the machine, and then wait for hours before it produced an answer. So I won't ask you to guess what the answer was, but I inadvertently told it, the computer, that I liked electronics and I liked working outside. So the computer decided that I should become a television aerial erector. I didn't become a television aerial erector, but that's what the computer thought I ought to do with my life. Having done that, I actually went to a real person who was, we were asked to consult with a real person who was providing proper career advice on the basis of her experience. So I was asked by an interviewer yes, it was Lex Friedman, what motivated you to go into the area of neuroscience? And my answer was, from the age of 15, I wanted to be a neuroscientist, but neuroscience, as we know it today, did not exist at that time. For me, and at that time, it was some form of what was then called mathematical psychology. So I therefore went to my careers advisor and told him I wanted to be a psychologist, but I also wanted to do physics. And he told me that if you want to be a psychologist, you have to be a doctor first. So he thought that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. And neither of us knew the difference. So I then went off to university and actually became a doctor without realizing I could have been a psychologist without having to train as a doctor. And then I ultimately became a psychiatrist and then eventually got back into research after qualifying and becoming a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, at which point I then started my research career at about age 28 at 29. And this brings me to the second answer, step 2. Basically, do what you're told. And specifically, what I've illustrated here is the books I was told to read by a lot of my mentors and people who I respected. So I've just listed a few here of some of the key works that influenced my career and thinking. The first was a book I was made to read shortly before going to university by my father, which is Arthur Eddington's Space, Time and Gravitation, written for intelligent lay people who wanted to understand general relativity in the early 20th century. This is Ray Dolan. He made me read a very simple, small text which introduced me to classical statistics through the analysis of covariance. Jerry Edelman, who was a Nobel laureate for discoveries in immunoglobulins, emphasized the importance of biological thought by making me read The Growth of Biological Thought by Ernst Mayr. And in fact, he was so horrified that I was trying to frame everything in terms of equations. He banned me from the office for 6 months and made me sit in the library and read a whole library of biological books, including this one. So once I'd done that, he actually forgave me and let me come back into the laboratory and gave me a signed copy of The Growth of Biological Thought. But it's interesting that recognizing the importance of biology and biotic self-organization, the life sciences, was so central to Jerry Edelman, but it was also very central in my responses to artificial intelligence, saying that we don't want artificial intelligence, we want natural intelligence in artifacts and artificial systems that conform to the same biomimetic or biological processes. And a lot of that response was based upon reading books of this sort. And then finally, Chris Frith, who is one of the world's experts in psychology of schizophrenia, and formal theories thereof, maybe read things like read Godel. So read what you're told to read. What I found extremely useful is Wikipedia, having quick access to the wealth of human knowledge has really accelerated my career. So in your epistemic foraging for information, then read what you're told to read, but also go and explore on the web, possibly with a large language model. Then the third answer: if you want to make a difference, you have to have an idea which is useful, or make sure that they're too big to be ignored. Which means that the contribution has to be far-reaching and generic, but crucially it has to be useful. And by useful, that effectively means enabling other people. So another way of expressing that is that people, either politicians or patients or causes, they want tools and approaches that enable them to answer the questions that are important to them. So that's something I have learned, that to make a difference and to contribute, you have to be able to enable other people. And examples of that in my career are what was mentioned in the very nice introduction, statistical parametric mapping, which is not in and of itself a discovery. It is an invention which allows other people to make discoveries in the instance of statistical parametric mapping. about functional specialization in the brain and the functional architectures that underwrite our neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. Anatomy specifically in terms of voxel-based morphometry, and in latter years moving away from the principle of functional specialization to the principle of functional integration and how different brain areas talk to each other by being able to estimate the influence that one node or brain region has on another brain region through, in this instance, an example of complex system modeling called dynamic causal modeling. And then you can write your own book, and then you can tell a young person to read that. And then finally, having big ideas effectively means having ideas that are enabling in the sense that they bring together or unify or reveal the relationships between other people's ideas. And that's the agenda of the free energy principle, which is meant to stand in as a minimal first principle framework within which you can understand how we make sense of the world and how we make decisions when engaging with that world, either by asking questions or prompting or querying the world or acting upon and moving within that world. So the free energy principle, which I think we're going to talk about shortly, is the physics backstory to active inference and active sensing and active learning, that provides a normative framework in which to model and measure and infer the generative models that people bring to the table to understand their world and make decisions in an uncertain world. This physics backstory is mathematically, well, people often say it's difficult to understand. It's not actually, it's quite simple, and the maths is fairly straightforward. And all it says is that if you can distinguish the states, if you want to talk about something, or say you want to talk about self-organization, you have to be able to define mathematically and very precisely what you mean by the self or a thing. And that immediately requires you to make a distinction between the states of something or oneself and everything else or all the other constituents of your environment. Mathematically, that can be done in terms of, well, in systems theory by specifying the inputs and the outputs to the internal states of something, say a brain or a cell, and the outputs. Mathematically, one can also frame this in terms of Markov boundaries or blankets, where the inputs and the sensory states and the outputs and the active states, and just writing down this separation or partition into self and non-self, separated by these boundary states, one can then derive, using basic physics, a description of self-organization that has all the hallmarks of decision-making under uncertainty, that complies with, say, the principles of optimal Bayesian design in terms of the way we sample our world, but also Bayesian decision theory in terms of how we comply with constraints, read as costs of being in certain states or soliciting certain outcomes. And that's the free energy principle. And then you can write another book. In fact, you can cheat and get your younger friends to write the book for you. My younger friends in this instance were people about the same stage as you are. Well, no, 2 years ahead in terms of the medical training, namely Thomas Parr, who's currently doing his residency in neurology at Oxford in the UK, and a slightly older colleague, but still younger than me, Giovanni, who was in Rome, in Italy. And then that's it. You can then tell your students to read the book that your students wrote. Applications of this from your point of view, I think may be interesting to talk about. Why would you want a mechanics of inference and belief updating and decision making? Well, there are a number of important applications of this in the context of neurology and psychiatry, and possibly beyond in terms of cardiology and immunology. My favorite example of this is computational psychiatry. Understand the physics of belief updating and the way that we make sense of our world is important in generating particular hypotheses about the physiological mechanisms and the psychological descriptions of these mechanisms in action, to tie them all together in the spirit of the free energy principle, so that you can now think about psychiatric disorders in terms of false inference. And this is a review that I wrote a couple of years ago, using this formal approach, this physics of sentience, to connect synapses to sentience. So that's it. That's the short review of the kind of advice that I would give you if I was there with you. Let's escape.
Okay.
Good. Let's stop.
All right. So I have two questions for you. First of all, do you think if you asked AI today what your job should be, do you think it would give you the right answer?
Well, somebody did that for me, and he gave an extremely good answer, yes. So I suspect it will be extremely good, yes.
Okay. I'll ask my second question after one of our panelists, Aditi.
Hello, I'm Aditi. Actually, I have a question. Like, we're talking about AI and the advancement that's happening around in the world with AI. We may soon have AI doctors around the world. I guess China has released one AI specialized hospital recently in May. Will the AI ever surpass the human touch that we have? So that, or if so, will that be a threat to us doctors?
Um, That would certainly be, I think it's going to be realized as a fantasy. I have seen attempts over the past 20, 30 years to try and automate diagnostic interviews using a computer as the doctor. They all fail. I've seen startups in the past 5 years, very well funded, millions, if not billions of dollars invested, trying to use artificial intelligence to reproduce the question and answer that one might engage in when trying to clarify differential diagnosis in the outpatient clinic, and they fail. About 8 years ago, Geoffrey Hinton famously claimed that using medical image analysis and understanding, applying artificial intelligence, say deep learning, to recognize tumors in chest x-rays or neoplastic change in pathohistological studies, was going to make radiologists redundant. And what happened was that the actual rate of application to radiology posts in the United States fell. And then about 2 years later, there was a shortage of radiologists. So it can have an effect. It's a very negative effect, because, in fact, that just never turned out to be true. Back in 1990, the early 90s, we already had what would now be known as diffusion models, automatic, very similar to the voxel-based morphometry, but predicated, but deployed in a way to try and diagnose people with early onset Alzheimer through thinning of the cortex, certain parts of the cortex, using a VBM-like approach, voxel-based morphometry approach, and it already outperformed doctors, getting 98% accuracy. And I remember even going on television talking about it in 1990. No one used it. No one's interested in in having some probabilistic prediction or classification, because diagnosing and treating in an active way with a patient is a process of inference, and the art of being a doctor is to disclose the right evidence to resolve your differential diagnosis, so that you can then identify the best kind of treatment. So this is the process that I was just describing in terms of generically, being intelligent is to infer, but also when you bring in the active part, then that means that you have to act in a way that secures the sensory data or the diagnostic information that resolves your uncertainty about this patient. And it's important to phrase it like that, because the best action is that which resolves the greatest amount of uncertainty, which means the best action depends upon what you believe and what you know about this patient, which means you can't write that into a large language model. The large language model will always give you the same the same response to the same prompt. Whereas to be a doctor, to be a diagnostic machine, to be, I would argue, just to be sentient, is to act in a way that is conditioned upon your current beliefs about the state of affairs in the world that you're contending with. This is to be a true agent. Which is what I meant before, that large language models and that kind of AI are not agents. They don't have a generative model of the consequences of their action. And furthermore, they don't have as the right cost function the ability to choose those actions that are going to resolve uncertainty. And you can write this down mathematically in terms, and it has been done by Dennis Lindley in the 1950s, in terms of the principles of optimal experimental design, which is what is the best experiment to perform. And by experiment here, I mean asking your patient and the outpatients the right questions to elicit the right psychiatric history or the right family history, to focus on the particular sleep aspects of their sleep which are relevant and informative for what you think might explain this patient's symptoms, or prescribing the right blood tests or the right scans. Some will be redundant because they're not going to resolve any uncertainty, because you know exactly that it's this or that. Some will be very relevant. So you have to choose very, very carefully. So most of your life is going to be, and one could argue this is generally true of everything, is making decisions about how to act as an agent, as a doctor in your case, in order to reduce your uncertainty about this patient. I don't see artificial intelligence in its current form getting anywhere near that. Having said that, I should also qualify it in terms of our discussion before about filling in the research gaps. You can certainly use artificial intelligence in its broad sense very fluently, very efficiently, to enable you to be a good doctor. And by a broad sense of artificial intelligence, I'm not talking about large language models. I'm talking about basically the ability to adapt any universal function approximator to map from this to that. That's effectively what a neural network is. So how can you use neural networks to do that very efficient mapping? Well, to amortize, to make easy complex, time-consuming, low-level tasks that require you to just map from one set of variables to another set of variables. So I think that artificial intelligence, in the broader sense, has a great role to play. It's just there to make your life easier. So lots of examples about this would be robotics, AI in robotics, to do surgery, for example, either brain surgery or operating on prostate cancer, by using a little robot, or by using not laser, by using technology that doesn't actually involve you put a hands-on approach, but you're doing it via a robot that can sort of anticipate and make your life much easier. Stereotactic localization in functional neurosurgery, again, using all the universal approximation tools available in AI, just to make the spatial registration of the brain with some stereotactic frame of reference immediately available to you, so that as a neurosurgeon you can use your robot to pinpoint exactly the right part of the brain. In pharmacology, you can use it now to sift through candidate drugs that may have actions at this particular receptor. You can use it to analyze your data. So there are lots of ways in which your generic AI will make your life easier, but to live as a doctor is not going to go away, because it is the life of a doctor, is the life of resolving uncertainty about your patient and then intervening and testing hypotheses about how you can make this patient better.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'll ask Mansi to ask the next question, and then we'll move on to my colleagues' questions, and then we'll end this session.
Hello, sir. Um, Hi. Although most of the aspects of what I was going to ask is somewhere you already mentioned in the previous question, but as a medical student, I see that AI is a generational change which is coming into the medical industry. So how is it going to change the curriculum, medical curriculum? So basically, earlier we used to have a lot of things that were simply memory based, but later on it shifted to more clinical approach, especially the Indian change which has been brought to these subjects and approach. They have shifted it more to teach the clinical aspects of whether it's anatomy, whether it's physiology, rather than just asking the students to memorize the orientations and positions of various muscles and nerves and all. It has shifted more to clinical. So now I think there is again a big change. So where do you think these the curriculum and teaching style as well as the course will have a like complete change? So in which direction will it be?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I'm not necessarily the best person who's qualified to answer that. There are people who are, actively
Sorry to
in this.
interrupt you, sir. I'll just mention about an incident that happened with me today because in today's pharmacology class, we were asked to classify and come and tell it on stage the classification of hyperlipidemic drugs, anti-hyperlipidemic drugs. So I was the only person among all the 5 and 6 person who were asked to come up and speak it on stage. I was the only one who could not actually, tell the classification. No matter how many times I memorize it, I am very bad at names. So I found really bad. But I was thinking like whether my brain is made to, store more data or to analyze it. I understood the classification, but I didn't remember the names. I messed up on the stage. So yeah.
Well, I'm sure all your friends and teachers will forgive you. I mean, you could make the same argument in terms of spelling. Since, and certainly I now invariably, not only do I use a spell checker, but I now use a dictaphone, a speech recognition. So I don't have to remember how to spell words anymore. I couldn't spell there properly if I was actually had to write it out by hand, because I don't need to anymore. So I think there is a natural progression. Again, we come back to this notion of the extended environment and extended cognition. And the environment being designed, and the notion of designed environment, that a lot of our competences are now being offloaded into the environment, into machines, into artifacts, into iPhones, into computers, into rumbas, and possibly autonomous vehicles in the distant future. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I suspect it's a natural thing, and it just reflects the fact that you don't need to remember all the instances. You don't need to remember the insertion of the muscles, all the muscles on the distal aspect of the radius on the left arm, because you can just pull up an image or get ChatGPT just to list the important aspects when you need it. So this would be a little bit like the telephone numbers being, you don't need to remember telephone numbers anymore. Because you can just call up that from your memory in your iPhone. So I think that's quite a natural thing, and I think you're absolutely right. It will change the curriculum, and you'll be focusing much more on an active engagement. So when you say clinical, I think that's probably quite appropriate, because to my mind, those aspects of anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry that matter to you in your life, in what you do and the decisions you make, are usually going to be those that have relevance, that have clinical relevance. So as an agent who's using this knowledge, it's probably more important you have the concepts and the constructs at hand that underwrite the way that you would actually use these in a clinical context. So I think that's quite natural. But there is another side to this. So beyond elemental training, And I should just add, there are of course debates. Not only is the curriculum changing, but the way that you are tested. Because of course, if you're allowed to use large language models to write your thesis or your essays, then there's a question: are you allowed to use large language models to help you write your understanding and your thesis? And a lot of people are saying, well, that's not a good test anymore. Perhaps we just have to do lots of MCQs. And so I think not only in the curriculum, but also in the way that you're evaluated in terms of passing and failing will also be affected in the long term. And certain universities, certainly in Switzerland, are now insisting on returning to in-person interviews. So they're not even using multiple choice questionnaires or marked essays, that you now have to actually answer in person the questions, because that's the only way that the assessor can assess what you know and what you understand in relation to, because it takes a lot of time and it's a very different way, and it's almost going back to the way it was done in the 1970s and 80s. But there are two other interesting issues here. Beyond medical student training, when you get to specialist training, you may well there is a pressure to emphasize as part of your specialist training and the curricula the skill set you will need to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning and more generally statistics and tools that you have at your disposal, computational tools. So certainly in psychiatry, for example, there's been a lot of emphasis or discussion about skilling people in statistics and computational approaches to psychiatry, so they can now use these new tools in a wise and fluent way. So that, I think, will be it's not artificial intelligence removing what you have to memorize from Gray's Anatomy or Mountcastle's physiology. It's much more now teaching you how to use AI in a wise way, in a useful way. And to do that, you need the right foundational training. And that brings me to my final point. There is that would be the positive aspect to engaging with the AI, basically being trained to understand the principles and how to use it properly and how to deploy it. There is another argument, though, that says there's a danger in relying too much on artificial intelligence. And this is the argument put forward by people like Olaf Spons, the inventor of the connectome, where he is worried about data scientists. So we're all going to become data scientists. We just need to know how to use large language models and databases and knowledge graphs, and that's it. We don't need to know anything about the subject. We just need to become a good data scientist. The problem is there's no foundational training, so there's no grounding or deep understanding of the kind of system that you are working in, or from the point of view of clinical medicine. There's no understanding of the anatomy and the physiology and the pathophysiology. You don't understand the mechanisms. You just understand how to move the data around and test for various differences or classify different things without knowing the meaning of the classification that you have just made using artificial intelligence. So I think there is a danger in reifying the utility of data scientists and people who are just experts at machine learning without being an expert in anything else, because they don't have the right foundational training. So I think you have to find that happy balance behind having the foundational training, so you have a deep understanding, a good generative model of your body and the patient's body and your mind and the patient's mind, at all levels of description, mechanistically and philosophically, before you can properly deploy artificial intelligence. So these debates, I'm sure, are going on at the moment, and they do point to, both of them, I think, do actually point to a change in the curriculum as it parallels developments in technology and artificial intelligence.
All right.
Thank you so much, sir. I think the point that you mentioned, that analyzing the data or data analysis is my takeaway from the conversation. The bottom line of the question that I asked and the answer that you gave to me is what I keep in my mind from now. Thank you so much.
All right, so we have a few more questions, but we would rather take it at the end. For the time being, Shreyansh would be asking you a few questions about your research, and in the end, we'll see if we have time for the rest. I hope you're not tired.
I'm fine, thank you.
All right, yeah. So, yeah, I pass the mic on to Shreyansh.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So you basically, in your theory of free energy principle, you explain that the brain is constantly scanning our environment and basically creating a Gaussian distribution of the probabilistic events, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So when this process breaks down, you mentioned that it leads to some neuropsychiatric diseases like hallucination. Are there any other manifestation that might not be so obvious?
Yes, I think so. So just to recap your question, our work in theoretical neurobiology and computational neuroscience suggests that there is always a description of anything, and in particular people and other creatures, in terms of them inferring the state of the world, making sense of their sensory data by updating their beliefs about what caused that data. So when you talked about sort of Gaussian probability distributions, that is one important aspect of these mathematical or probabilistic beliefs, that our neuronal dynamics and neural activity are encoding or representing. And just technically, if you're interested, that's the Laplace assumption, that the belief structure can be just summarized in terms of a location parameter, or the average or the expected value of something, but also its uncertainty in terms of the variance or the standard deviation. So with just those two representations, for example, the activity of a neural population and its sensitivity to inputs in terms of synaptic efficacy, those would be two ways of encoding these two values that then represent a particular belief. And the idea behind active inference and the free energy principle is that we're constantly taking sensory data from the world and updating our beliefs about what caused those data. So if I see a face before me, what I'm actually receiving is this a pattern of inputs on my sensory epithelium, my retina, and then I'm now building an explanation for that in terms of, well, it's a particular face and they have particular identity and they have particular characteristics. So it's a multivariate Gaussian distribution or belief encoded in my neural activity that provides an accurate prediction or account of that pattern of sensory input. And this is happening all the time. And you can tell stories about predictive processing as a description of this. What you are effectively saying, that this process of belief updating, which describes how we engage with the world when we put action into the loop, means that we are just processes of inference. So how can you regard any pathology? Well, if our psychology just is inference, then any psychopathology or pathology can always be read as false inference. And what kinds of false inference are there? Well, there is the same kind of false inference that you get in statistics. So you have probably done in your 101 statistics courses type 1 and type 2 errors, which put very simply mean when inferring the cause of some data, say a difference in the mean of two groups, when you've just got some sparse data that you usually use a t-test to make the inference, you can make two kinds of mistakes. You can infer there's a difference when there isn't, and that would be like inferring something was there when it was not. So that would be like an hallucination, hallucinating something that's there when it's not present. Or you can make a type 2 error, which means you've failed to detect something when it is there. So this, from the point of view of psychopathology, would be failing or inferring something was not there when it was. And you can see that in clinical psychiatry, for example, in terms of neglect syndromes, dissociative syndromes, sometimes known as hysterical syndromes, functional neurological symptoms like anesthesia. So inferring that would be another kind of false inference. And then you start to ask yourself, what could cause that? And in answer to your question, what are generalizations of this? So to answer your question, what other things might be hidden? Well, I'm not sure anything's going to be hidden, but certainly what other domains could you bring this argument to bear upon? And there are other domains, because inference is just one, if you like, aspect of this kind of self-evidencing that plays out at a particular time scale. So inference, in the way that I've been talking about at the moment, plays out at the time scale of neuronal dynamics, the time scales of event rate potentials, several hundred milliseconds, certainly in the realm of tens to hundreds of milliseconds, as the sensorium fluctuates and things change around me and I'm talking. The same kinds of processes, though, can also be found at much slower timescales. For example, learning. So here we're now not talking about fluctuations in synaptic activity, we're now talking about fluctuations in synaptic efficacy, synaptic connection weights. And they change much more slowly. They could change over minutes and hours in terms of short-term plasticity, or days and weeks in terms of experience dependent on motor learning and long-term potentiation of various synapses. So that can also go wrong. So there may be failures to learn, or overlearning, learning things anomalously, or failures to learn. And then you can start to think about what that would look like from the point of view of a doctor, that there is a failure to learn, especially at a neurodevelopmental level. So this kind of learning is most prominent during early neurodevelopment, but continues throughout life, obviously. But there are certain periods of plastic potential areas in the brain that show a high degree of neuroplastic potential that would be particularly vulnerable to failures to learn properly. Simple examples might be cerebral anoxia in utero, rendering a neonate very exposed to failures of inference that were not primarily due to fast belief updating or neural dynamics, but was simply due to the fact that there was a failure of learning because there was some abnormality. You can also sort of apply similar arguments to faster modulations of synaptic efficacy through neuromodulators. And then you've got an even longer time. Well, other examples would be the fluctuations in that we see during sleep-wake cycles, for example, and these speak to the next level, which is not the parameters of your generative model of the states of the world, but to the very structure itself. If you remember earlier on, I was talking about sort of different levels of inference in terms of inference learning and selection. So what I'm talking about now is selecting the right structures, the right synapses, the right connectome, the right number of neuronal populations in a brain, a process that can be, again, read at a neurodevelopmental level, but also at an evolutionary level. But if we just stick to the neurodevelopmental or somatic time frame, then these processes also unpack in terms of synaptic regression during the sleep-wake cycle. So you can now imagine failures of false inference at this time scale would look like disorders of synaptic regression or plasticity. And you can even generalize that notion not to just nerve cells, but to any cells. And generally you get into the game of cancer, for example, that there are certain certain conditions that could be expressed in terms of a failure to select the right cells to subject to regression or apoptosis, so that they don't actually eliminate themselves in the right kind of way or situate themselves in the right kind of way with respect to other cells. And then you can get into a narrative of the kind that people like Mike Levin would pursue at Tufts University, which is thinking about cancer and immunological conditions as the same kind of false learning that can always be described from the point of view of a theoretician in terms of false inference on a particular time scale.
So basically, this active inference, it can pack a lot of pathologies and explain them, like you said, cancer, even neuropsychiatric disorders. But how do we use it to make forecasts about the brain and the dynamics that the brain has?
Right. So again, that's an excellent question. So how would you use this theoretical resource practically in a clinical context? I think there are two main applications that one might consider. The first is that if you've got a formal or computational account about how a brain or body or immune system works. Let's just stick to the brain, really, because we're talking about artificial intelligence, but in principle, you can apply the same principles to any self-organizing system, such as the immune system or the autonomic nervous system or the cardiac system or whatever. But if we just stick to the brain, I think it's conceptually cleaner. If you've got a first principle formal account of how a brain makes sense of cues or data and makes decisions, then you can reproduce that in silico. You can basically build a digital twin of your patient. If you can build a digital twin or a model of your patient, then what you can do is optimize the parameters of that model in order to explain the patient's decisions and behavior. Now, this doesn't have to be, this behavioral responses can be at many different levels. It could be neuronal responses, so you could build models that predict electrophysiological responses. An example of this would say be the mismatch negativity paradigm using EEG in distinguishing between autoimmune encephalitis and schizophrenia, for example. Or it could be a behavior report using an economics game where you're looking at the choice behavior, or it could be a psychophysics report using galvanic skin responses or pupillary dilatation. And for every one of these ways of phenotyping a particular person, if you've got a digital twin of that particular person who is doing the same paradigm, responding to an oddball in a mismatch negativity, or an angry face in a galvanic skin response, or a noxious stimulus in a pain paradigm, then you can adjust the parameters of your digital twin in order to reproduce the same responses in this limited experimental context, which is basically, you're developing a particular clinical tool in terms of a paradigm which you could use at the bedside that you can now reproduce in silico. If you can do that, that means you can phenotype every given person and in terms of the generative model they're bringing to the table, in particular their prior beliefs about the world, and you can reproduce that or repeat that to try and ask questions about the difference between this kind of patient and that kind of patient. So this computational phenotyping application is already being used in an early literature to now not just describe the difference between the responses of this group and that group, say people with and without addiction or obsessional compulsive disorder, but to now say the best and simplest explanation is that these people believe that in this kind of paradigm, the probability of changing their environment is this, and that is significantly lower than the belief that this person has, simply because you can now estimate their prior beliefs by reading from an explainable generative model that is reproducing the same kind of behavior that this person is eliciting. So this is one way of using computational psychology, one way of using active inference in computational psychiatry. I should just note there are others, that we were talking about earlier on. You can still use computational techniques to analyze data. So that's a simple way of using AI to analyze data. But a more subtle and I think informative way of using artificial intelligence is to mimic biological intelligence, and particularly mimic the intelligence of your patient, and then actually identify and phenotype your patient's responses in terms of the implicit prior beliefs. If you can do that, and now you have an understanding of the biophysical mechanisms, and here we're talking about usually synaptic efficacy and its modulation, neuromodulation, and the encoding of uncertainty. Remember, you started by talking about Gaussians with the mean and the variance. Well, the inverse variance is the precision, and I liken that to the, or suggest that might be encoded by synaptic efficacy. If that's true, then that means that short-term modulation of synaptic weights or strength or synaptic efficacy is a crucial aspect of any neurological condition or psychiatric condition, which means now I'm looking at biophysical mechanisms that would be responsible for that optimization or modulation in my digital twin. What are those? Well, they are precisely the neuroreceptors that are the targets of classical neuromodulatory systems that are also exactly the targets, the synaptic receptors or the neurotransmitter receptors that are targeted by most psychoactive drugs or drugs in neurology or epilepsy. So now you've got a connection now between a mechanistic understanding of the decision making in your patient, but also the biophysical, biochemical, and neuropharmacological mechanisms that you'd expect to be in play in this patient, and that provides now a rationale for interventions of a pharmacological sort in a principled way. So that would be one example of how to apply this, in hundreds of use cases, each of which would have to be validated carefully as the years roll on, and then deployed. The other application, though, is just providing a simple explanation for your patient and her family. So very often, what people want is to understand themselves and why they are feeling like this, or why they have this symptom, or why are they recovering like this. And sometimes you don't. All is required is a model, a description, an explanation of what's going on. Very much akin to, say, cognitive behavior therapy for certain conditions that can be resolved simply by explaining, well, this is how you're feeling, this is why you're feeling like that. Say, take hyperventilation and panic attacks. If you explain that why it is that they're getting paresthesia or tetanic contractions in terms of calcium concentrations that are influenced by the rate at which you're blowing off CO2, then the patients, oh, I see. And then very often they now have a sufficiently good model to intervene and understand their behavior, which takes away the uncertainty and the anxiety. So, it's not a very technically advanced deployment, but it certainly can be clinically very useful, just sharing a mechanistic understanding of the way that certain people make sense of their worlds or experience their world. And I could go on, there are other applications, but that's probably over-answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was a satisfactory explanation for me. Thank you. Actually, is it fine if I ask you one more question?
Yes, of course. Well, it's not up to me. You'll have to ask the other.
I don't think she's here, which is why I'm asking right now.
All right.
So basically, we have our exams coming up in the next month. So how can we utilize this free energy principle to actively learn more efficiently? Like, is there any way we can utilize it?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. In terms of self-understanding, it is going to be quite natural. You're going to get more and more anxious as the exams approach. And that comes back to what you were talking about, or what we were talking about before, which is the uncertainty representation. So if you remember, we were talking about false inference, and I was saying that there are ways in which you can break inference, and all this rests effectively on estimating the uncertainty. So if you're doing a t-test, that will be estimating the standard error. Now your brain has to do that. So lots of your brain, and you could argue everything that is involved in attentional or intentional set, or setting learning rates, is involved in estimating the uncertainty. And of course, examination, a life event that you have never experienced before, like a driving test, or to be more morbid, like the death of a loved one. There are certain things in life you have never experienced before. These naturally, because you have a very sophisticated self-model that you can roll out into the future and imagine a trajectory for yourself, at the point of these events, you don't know what's going to happen afterwards. Will you pass? Will you fail? What's going to happen to me if I fail? What are people going to say? What kind of person will I be? But you just don't know. And that's always anxiety-inducing. And that anxiety is usually modeled in my world in terms of a loss of certainty about what to do and what I will be doing in the future. So to understand that means that if you're not anxious, you're not working properly. But the nice thing is that anxiety, basically the inverse of precision, can always be read as a learning rate. So when you're anxious, you learn more quickly. So mathematically, the way that works is that you put more weight on evidence that's coming in, and the evidence that you will be particularly focused on is the evidence in textbooks or evidence in past exam papers, what your tutors and lecturers are saying at this moment, and the way that how quickly and the kind of responses that you make or don't make. In assimilating that evidence, there is always a balance between how much you make it change your mind in terms of learning, and how much you are resistant to that because you have prior beliefs about the way you should behave and what you are seeing in the moment, either textual material or educational material. That balance is again determined by the relative precision. So this is just an elemental aspect of some Bayesian belief update or Bayesian multisensory or hierarchical Bayesian belief updating. And what happens is that when you're uncertain about your prior beliefs and what's going to happen to you or how you will respond, that means that the precision of the sensory evidence has a greater effect, which allows the sensory evidence to have a greater effect on your belief updating. And what that looks like is an increased learning rate. So that means you will, in the absence of having any prior beliefs about the causes of your sensations, you will effectively pay more attention to, or be more influenced by, or learn more quickly from the evidence at hand. They're all, if you like, descriptions of exactly the same mechanism. And of course, you're in control of the precision because you're estimating the precision, you're estimating the standard error all the time. So what's going to happen to you is you're going to get increasingly anxious as the exams approach, and you're going to learn more and more quickly. And then you're going to realize that's perfectly Bayes optimal. And then you'll stop getting anxious and have a good night's sleep, and then it'll all start again. And that's exactly how it should be. So you're not going to be able to use the free energy principle to improve your performance, but you can use the free energy principle to understand why you are behaving optimally for you. Yeah. So by definition, let me just qualify that. There is no optimality in the sense that you are the optimal thing for the kind of person and the kind of clinician you are by just existing. So you can't do things better or worse. And in fact, you can prove that mathematically through something called the complete class theorem. So for any given pair of cost functions or evaluation functions and behaviors, there are always some prior beliefs in your brain that make every decision you make base optimal. So what that means is the only difference between you and your next door neighbor is just the prior beliefs you bring to the table, including your prior beliefs about precision and anxiety and yourself. So you are always base optimal by the complete class theorem, which is another way of saying unless you're unhappy with the way you are, there's no need to change anything. Unless you think you're engaging in false inference or self-delusion, don't worry about changing anything. Just enjoy your Bayesian mechanics. Enjoy the fact that you are on this path of least action that is going to experience a period of anxiety and a period of rapid learning. That you will then forget, and afterwards you will have different agendas. Is that reassuring?
I think you pretty much explained every examination cycle that I've had so far this year.
All right. I'll ask one more small question, and I hope you'll keep it small as well, and then we'll wrap it up. Imagine someone is in medical school and they want to do what you're doing. What is the path they should take?
Yeah. Well, we were discussing before we started your particular career trajectory. It is. I think it's a very attractive but very challenging choice to try and integrate a clinical career with an academic career. Ideally, what you would do is become an academic clinician, which means having a commitment on the wards and maintaining a clinical investment in terms of seeing patients, while at the same time reserving either 2 or 3 or 4 days a week for research, depending upon the stage of your career, which could be purely theoretical, but always underwritten and inspired by your clinical understanding and the agenda. To build such careers means that you're going to have to work very hard, because to be a good clinician requires all your energy. To be a good scientist and academic theoretician requires complete 100% commitment. So it's extremely difficult to do both and feel good about doing both. So you have to accept that ambivalence, accept you can't do both perfectly, but you need to do both to be a clinical academic. If you're an academic and you're applying for if you're a clinician and you're applying for academic funding, you will be in a much more powerful position, because you will have an authenticity, because you'll have the foundational understanding and training in the clinical target of your academic work. And in exactly the same way, if you are being asked to advise or review a clinical intervention, then if you have academic credentials, people are going to take you more seriously. So there are real benefits to having a bilateral career, but it is extremely difficult. So and you can basically you just have to mix and match. You just have to partition your career into periods of clinical training, and then periods of academic research, and then periods of academic training, clinical training, and then periods of academic research under the constraints of your clinical curriculum or the professional body for your speciality. And you can do that at a number of levels. Some people have the opportunity to do an intercalated MSc as part of their clinical training. So you do that academic work very early on, and then you go back into foundation years or house jobs, depending upon which country you're in. Or you can become qualified as a clinician, and then do a master's and a PhD at the beginning of your clinical training, or you can do it at the end of your clinical training. And having done the PhD, then you'd be looking for clinical fellowships that would enable you to pursue the work you did in your PhD, which would normally be about 3 years in the UK, with an academic appointment, a clinical academic appointment. So it's difficult, but the nice thing is there are lots of opportunities to build this kind of hybrid career as an academic clinician. You can do it at the MSc level before you take your finals. You can do it after you've done your finals and your foundation year as a PhD, or you can do a PhD quite late in life. If you wanted to pursue a career like mine, if you remember, I didn't start my research until I was 28, 29 years of age. So prior to that, it was just clinical training right up to the level of becoming a member of the Royal College. And then I started my career with effectively like a PhD and then postdoctoral commitments. So there's nothing wrong with leaving the academic part until you feel that you have fully understood the area that you want to contribute to. There's still plenty of time to make a difference, so don't feel rushed. On the other hand, it's never too early to start, because you started very early, didn't you? You were sending me material when you were about 15, if I remember.
Yeah. I mean 16, but yeah, either way. Anyways, thank you so much for being with us. It was genuinely a pleasure. Let's wrap it up. And is there anything you would like to say?
No, just to thank you for your very gracious hosting. Thank you very much indeed.
All
Great
right.
to have the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye then.
Bye. Bye.